Okay. We're going to get started with the final lecture for today, which is going to be advanced CSS and other libraries. So let's go over advanced CSS first. So some of the topics we'll be looking into are CSS combinators, display types, content overflow, and some animations. To start, you're not going to need an IDE. Just go into your browser and go to play.tailwindcss.com. And then once you're there, you'll see a screen like this behind me, and you're going to want to update your code. So you can just delete what's in HTML and keep whatever is in CSS. Okay. So once you did that, your playground should look something like this. You should see the 4 elements right there. And let's get started. So first, we're going to talk about CSS combinators. So what they are basically they specify relationships between CSS selectors. So some examples of selectors are the name of HTML tags. So for example, we have the div or the paragraph tag. We're going to be going over 4 different CSS combinators. We have the descendant selector, which is just the space, the child selector, which is like the greater than sign, the adjacent sibling selector, which is the plus, and the general sibling selector, which is the tilde. So the descendant selector basically matches all elements that are descendants of the specified element. So if you look at our example here, we're looking at the class .container, and we're selecting all descendants that are div elements, and we're applying a font size of 20 pixels. So in this case, we can go over to our playground, go over to CSS, and then we can type what we wrote on the slides. And so the thing about the descendant selector is that it doesn't really matter how deeply nested the children are. So for example, subchild 1 is affected the same way as any other element despite being nested. Yeah. This one? Where to open? Where's the mouse? The desktop. So the next one is the child selector, and this is the greater than sign. And this matches all elements that are direct children of the specified element. So in this case, our specified element is the section with the ID of the class of container, and we're selecting all direct children that are divs. So let's go into our CSS and update it and see what happens. So if you notice in our code right here, we have 4 children, but if you notice the first one is a smaller font size than the other 3 children, and that's because that one is a section and it's not a div, and it's despite the subchild being nested in that div over there, the child selector only selects the direct children, so the CSS isn't applied to subchild 1, but it is applied to child 2, 3, and 4. Next is the adjacent sibling selector. Just like it sounds, it is going to select the one that is directly after our specified element. And in this case, when you look at the HTML, that means whatever comes right after, as far as like when you read it from top to bottom. So let's try the example. So as you can see here, the specified element is whatever our element is with the ID of C1. In this case, if we look over here, that is the section. That is a section tag that contains subchild 1, and it's selecting the next div that proceeds after that that element, which in this case is child 2, and that's why only child 2 has a different font color. Now we're going to look at the general sibling selector, which is our last one, and it's using the tilde. And this one selects all elements that are after your specified element. So you can imagine it has similar properties to what we did before, but instead we're going to change all of them. So if you apply that, you'll notice that child 2, 3, and 4 all have color red. All right, now we're going to look at some display types. So the display property basically allows us to tell the browser how we want an element to be displayed, as well as children on the page. So we've looked at block and flex, and today we'll be looking at grid and none. We'll be looking at grid and none. So let's first update the code in our playground. You can check the code on the slides while I update it as well. All right, so first we're going to look at display grid. This basically, as you'd imagine, tells the browser to display the child elements in a 2-dimensional grid layout. So it looks something like that. And to do that in CSS, all you need to do is write display grid. So why don't we do that? So first we have grid autoflow. Autoflow is a property that basically gives us the power to tell the browser how we want to handle child elements automatically once they've reached the end of our grid layout. So we have two values. We have row and columns. So rows basically instructing the browser to prioritize adding rows. And this is what grid will do by default, which is why you notice child 1, child 2, child 3, child 4, they all are just sort of unaffected because they're adding it in row order. Columns instructs the browser to do the opposite, so instead they're going to prioritize adding columns. So you can go into the CSS and update it and try it out for yourself. So as you can see, if I updated the flow row, the auto flow to column, then you'll notice that the children are now in columns. And that's what it should look like. We also have grid template rows and grid template columns. And it's similar in the sense that it automatically tells the browser how to handle certain behaviors. This time, we're essentially creating a quote-unquote template, telling the browser how many rows and columns we want, as well as the width and height of each column. So the number of values that you provide to the grid template rows or grid template columns tells you essentially the height and the weight, the height and the length of the element. So in this case, we're going to create a grid layout where rows 1 and 2 will have a height of 100 pixels, and then if we leave it at that and we have more elements, then we don't really have a specific behavior, and grid will automatically handle that by creating a height that will just allow the element to basically fit. So let's try that. So if you'll notice, the first two children have a height of 100 pixels, but then child 3 and child 4 don't have the same because we haven't really defined anything for it yet. And then we have the same thing here with grid template columns. Feel free to try it out on your own. Running a little low on time. And then finally, we're going to talk about display none. This is kind of self-explanatory, but it basically tells the browser that we don't want to show this element at all. There's a slight difference if you've ever tried visibility hidden. The difference is that visibility hidden keeps the element in the tree, but it doesn't actually, it still takes up space in our layout, whereas display none completely is basically saying don't even show up in the layout at all. And you can notice the two differences right here. So if you add this to your CSS and try it out, you'll notice that in the first one where we're using display 1, child 1 doesn't take up any space in our grid at all, which results in child 2 being the first element in our grid. Whereas where we're using visibility, you'll see that even though we can't see child 1, it's still taking up the space in the layout. Now we're going to talk about content overflow. The overflow property basically tells the browser how to handle child elements that are exceeding the size of the parent element. And we're going to look at 4 values, visible, hidden, scroll, and auto. So feel free to update your code in the playground. Do that right now. Okay. So you should see something like this. You should see the text kind of just spilling out while we have like a 50 by 50 pixel gray box. So that's kind of our default behavior, which is overflow visible. And it's pretty evident in the name that if there is any overflow, it's just going to be, we're just going to see it. We have overflow hidden, which basically completely clips it and hides it within the parent element. If you move your mouse and you try and scroll inside the gray box, it shouldn't work. We have overflow scroll, which basically tells the browser that we're going to display a scroll bar inside for the parent element. And this scroll bar is always going to be present. So even if you don't have anything inside the parent element that's overflowing, it's still going to show a scroll bar. So if you can't scroll, it's just going to show like an empty scroll bar that you can't really interact with. And then you have overflow auto, which is basically the same thing, but instead it's saying that only show the scroll bar if we actually need it. So if you look at the examples over there, the first one where we have overflow content and the scroll bar is needed, you'll actually see the scroll bar. But on the second one where we just have the word the and it's not overflowing, then we don't need the scroll bar. And then finally, we'll do a quick run through with some animations. We're going to be looking at some keyframes, how to call our animations, the duration, delay, and some timing functions. So if you could just reset the code in your playground to that.